Thanks a lot, everybody. This is after what's been a really interesting morning of presentations so far, I have the unenviable task of actually getting us done on time, which I am very happy to do. Although I have to say it's very interesting program, and I think this panel has a really great set of speakers that are hopefully going to take the work of kind of thinking about what, I hate to kind of quite use the business school cliche of theory to practice, but we are going to move the conversation a little more from what the research has found into the realm of what we can do with that research, which I think is a pretty important aspect of the problems. What I first wanted to do is just give a really big thanks and round of applause to Bruce Kogut and Michael Morris, who put this together. And Malia. I have Malia and Malia, who also has done a large amount of work, and I was going to thank Dana for her work on the previous panel and all the panelists. So I first wanted to just give a round of applause to everybody. This is really a wonderful program, and I think, the Bernstein Center, the Sanford Bernstein Center at the Business School has really taken the lead on some wonderful initiatives, which really kind of, I think about the role of leadership and ethics in a very broad context, which is exactly how we should be doing, how we at the Business School should be kind of thinking about these areas. So I enormously appreciate the effort involved in putting the session together. Given the time, I'm not going to go through the bios of each of our panelists, other than to say that this is just an enormously distinguished and impressive group of people. And I think I was certainly looking forward to this session. So we're gonna start out with Susan Sturm, who's the George Jaffin Professor of Law and Social Responsibility at Columbia Law School, who's going to talk about stereotypes in the law. And this will serve as a natural transition to actually talking about applying some of these issues in the business world and the political world.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here and to be part of a workshop that involves Susan's work. Susan really looms very large also in the law school, and hoping that in the question and answer she'll get to say a little bit about some of the work that she's actually done publishing with Linda Krieger in law reviews about the relevance of her work to the law. So we've heard some really important and interesting work about stereotyping, social psychology. We've heard about how it is looking like it even has some universal characteristics to it. It's embedded in decisions, it's embedded in environments, and under certain conditions, behavior associated with stereotypes can change. So the question is, what's to be done? So what I want to really focus on is really this question of linking research and action. So what are the implications of the work that we saw this morning on both stereotyping, stereotype threat, et cetera, for how we pursue change? What does it take to address what I've referred to as second generation bias? And really, I think we're seeing with Susan's work and others, we're really into probably the fifth generation. Are we really set up now to deal with the kinds of dynamics that we saw described so powerfully this morning as a matter of leadership, as a matter of policy, as a matter of practice? And then last and importantly, how can law and leadership create what I refer to as the architecture of inclusion? So I think we have to start by asking a question that is somewhat obvious, but I think needs to be put into a larger framework, which is the question, why is it so challenging to address the kinds of dynamics that we heard described this morning, either whether we call them structural inequality or second-generation discrimination. So I think the first important insight, which Susan actually spoke about, is that it's very difficult to name and detect this form of bias at the individual level. First of all, it's not how people think about, as Susan mentioned earlier, it's not how people think about the problem. It doesn't even necessarily appear at the time that it's happening. It's not how the law describes and defines discrimination. And this is something, again, that Susan and Linda have written about. The law really focuses on first-generation kinds of discrimination, the kind, blacks need not apply, or is some intentional, conscious decision to exclude people based on their class status. So the kinds of decisions we're talking about happen often without anyone knowing that they're happening. In fact, with them thinking they're doing just the opposite. Secondly, the conduct, and we heard this also in the medical discussion from the panel we just heard about, this conduct occurs in many critical junctures and locations across many different levels of the organization. And we know that from the academic context, we now have heard about it from the medical context, that many people and many institutions participate in producing very small differences in treatment that, as Virginia Valian and Jonathan Cole have talked about, accumulate over time and produce large disparities. And these can occur in the walls of a particular department, in the walls of the larger organization, in the context of the profession at large. Third, we see that it's social arrangements, again, something that has now been documented as an experimental matter, that perpetuate the stereotypes and the expression of bias. And these social arrangements could include anything from access to opportunity networks, differences in resources and social capital, stratification, how merit is defined, but all of those sustain these kinds of dynamics. The power to change or to resist change is highly distributed. It exists in many different locations. That's particularly true in academic context, and Virginia Valian has summed that up very beautifully in one of the talks that she gives, where she says, the provost says, I don't have the power, it's the deans. The deans say, I don't have the power, it's the chairs. The chairs say, I don't have the power, it's the faculty. And the faculty says, there's no leadership on this issue. So a fifth problem, and really an important one, is that all of these dynamics that produce stereotyping and bias are also connected with more general institutional values and dynamics and challenges that are themselves challenging to change. Think about how your department is governed. Think about how students are mentored. Think about how research is valued. Think about how merit is defined. All of these things interact with how it is that we understand the categories of identity that we were hearing about this morning. So, multi-level problems require multi-level strategies, right, and solutions. So it's really important as we think about how to design responses that we think about paying attention to, as Susan ended her talk with this morning, institution-level change and scaling up from the micro level. How do we build the capacity and the incentives for what I call, and others have called, institutional mindfulness? What do I mean by institutional mindfulness? This is enabling careful attention to decisions that ultimately determine whether women and men of all races and backgrounds will have the opportunity to thrive, succeed, and advance. So this is a set of inquiry questions, and we heard, interestingly, in the panels previously, the kinds of questions that really need to be asked at the individual level, at the group level, at the institutional level. This requires the capacity to ask questions. It requires the capacity to learn from what you learn from asking those questions. It requires the capacity to do that at the points at which that information will actually influence decision making. We heard that also this morning, that it's important to have that information available when you're actually making the treatment decision, and not only in an abstract talk that will not be triggered necessarily at the point at which you're actually making these decisions. So this requires a process of ongoing change. I don't think I'm saying anything surprising to say that those conditions don't exist in most institutions, and this is what I mean when I talk about an architecture of inclusion. What is it that's going to create the capacity to ask the kinds of questions, to make the kinds of decisions, to reward the kind of behavior that is going to create what Valerie referred to as this kind of psychology, this context, this environment, this psychology of inclusion. So this sounds like a lot to ask, right? Can this be done, right? So I want to start with an example to say that yes, it can be done. So I want to start with Mel Hochster. Mel Hochster is a mathematician, and these are his credentials. You know, he's a very prestigious mathematician at the University of Michigan. And in 2002, Mel Hochster won a big prize. He won the Margaret and Herman Sokol Faculty Award in the Sciences, which is usually an opportunity to give a big lecture and basically demonstrate your brilliance in mathematics. And this is one of the university's most prestigious honors. So Hochster chose this occasion to speak to a room of mostly male scientists and mathematicians about gender bias. This was the title of his talk. Women in Mathematics, We've Come a Long Way, or have we? And he discussed the dynamics of bias. He described, and I quote, overwhelming evidence of gender bias in evaluation of candidates. These are, quote, studies that have shown that gender bias is significant and pervasive. He took a multidisciplinary approach based on science. Of course, whose work did he rely on? Susan Fiske. So these are slides from his slides that he developed both for this talk and for what subsequently became part of the STRIDE initiative, which I'll tell you about in a moment, at the University of Michigan. Look familiar, right? So these are the slides that this mathematician is using as part of his talk on bias in mathematics. There she is. So schemas are describing what they are, right? Applied under circumstances of ambiguity, stress, time pressure, lack of critical mass. And here's their connection to practice. They affect evaluation. And so what he pulled together with the help of a group of people was not only the data coming from social psychology, but also data from sociology, from network theory, from decision theory, from institutional dynamics, from politics, political science, that shows not only how this operates at the micro level, but what are the conditions and practices, number one, that sustain this, and number two, that change it. So this is the impact that people reported about that this moment of this speech had at the University of Michigan. People walked out of that meeting as if they were thunderstruck. Quote, I had never thought about this gender thing before. It was that he, who was a member of the National Academy of Science, gave this talk. It was the drama of his gesture that really affected people. The information had been out, and he just had such a huge effect. Why? The National Academy of Science gets it. So he gave over this important occasion for himself. Instead of talking about math, he talked about the problem of gender in science. It was hugely important, an amazing lesson in how this progresses. So this impact, I just want to say, he was not doing this in a vacuum. There was a whole institutional change dynamic that both led to the talk and that led from the talk. So, and the consequence of that was that you had some, this was studied, that there were some real results in the changes in looking initially at hiring, which is not an adequate measure, but STRIDE started working. Mel Hochster's speech came right between 2001, 2002, 2002, 2003. We see initially a kick up in the hiring of women in science, and then here we see some other data indicating that, and this is reports from the advanced 5-year report at the University of Michigan, that there was in fact an increase in the hiring of females in science from 16% in 2002 to 34% in 2006, an increase in the percentage of female science and engineering faculty from 15% to 19%, and this is in part because of the people come in and people leave. So this is taking account of attrition, and then an increase in chairs during this time period from 1 to 7. So why was Mel Hochster effective in the way in which it was described? And I'm assuming for purposes of this that you'll give me that it was defective. It's not effective. It's not just that he gave a great speech at a very important moment, but that he was part of this multi-level initiative. So I want to focus on these 5 dimensions: the message, multidisciplinarity, who's the messenger. This is a multi-level initiative involving multiple leaders, and then these mediating institutions like the National Science Foundation. Starting with the message, this is the frame for how he was talking, and I think we heard some very interesting information this morning that really connects to this. So Hochster really connected the question of bias to an affirmative goal of improving science. This is the value that those scientists had, Valerie, right, was improving science. He used this occasion, and he used science to move beyond the frame of discriminatory intent and fault, and he instead connected it, as Advance has, to an affirmative vision of really trying to create the department, the school, the profession that you want to have, that you would value, that you see yourself as being a citizen of. And reducing bias was not, however, removed. It's not as if we stop talking about bias in this context, which is the move to colorblindness, but rather that you talk about discriminatory bias or other kinds of bias in the context of this broader frame of institutional citizenship. He also put multidisciplinarity into action. So often we have seen, for example, in the legal context, in an effort to go straight from the social science lab into social policy. Let's hang some pictures up on the wall. And maybe that's going to change cognitive bias. And everyone in the room knows that that in and of itself is not going to produce meaningful change in a workplace context. This is really taking account of the range of disciplines that you need to understand in order to create the environments in which the insights from social psychology are actually going to be meaningful. Third, it's the messenger, right? So here you have somebody with tremendous legitimacy and commitment who's in a role where he's operating at the convergence of systems. He's a chair, he's a leader in the profession, he's a researcher, he's an academic leader, and he's bringing all those roles together. You add that with being in a position where knowledge can actually influence action. Not only is he doing this at his speech, but he's doing this in search committee meetings. He's doing this when decisions are being made about who to bring to the university for research. He's doing this at times when we're talking about who's going to get research money. And he's got this expertise to be able to talk about social science, and he speaks the language of the scientists. So it's not Susan coming in, although she would be amazing. It is the mathematician talking to mathematicians. And finally, he's doing this in a context where he's part of a larger community of influence, both the other people sharing in his work, and this makes him what I call an organizational catalyst. These are individuals in institutional roles, enabling them to enlist people with social capital and knowledge to act as change agents. And one of the reasons we were talking about Susan's work, I told her I was going to embarrass her, but she is an intermediary who's working across a number of different locations. She's working in the legal arena, she's working in the psychology arena, she's working in the institutional arena, and she's a translator across all those different locations, as is Mel Hochster. Finally, fourthly, he's not alone. This is the group of multi-level leadership, STRIDE, who were created by the advanced program within University of Michigan, and these are all little Mel Hochsters who've all been gone through the same kind of process, and they're doing this in science, technology, engineering, math, social sciences at the University of Michigan, and now with NSF. So we have this multi-level approach to leadership. Leadership is not just changing the mindset of an individual leader who's going to leave, right? It's creating a context in which you're going to be able to use this kind of information to mobilize change relating to core values and key decisions. It's diffusing this leadership and coordinating it so that it's operating at all those different points where this information needs to be used for it to affect practice, and then creating the networks that are going to link those people together and support them, again, creating the architecture to develop and sustain multi-level leadership. And this is where this role of institutional intermediaries comes in, a place like the NSF. We could look at the program that put this conference together as an institutional intermediary operating within Columbia. These are organizations that are themselves located at the intersection of multiple systems that are in a position to build capacity, to leverage legitimacy, to pool knowledge, and to create accountability as part of being part of the community of practice. So where does the law fit into this, right? So you may be asking, where's the law in this, right? Have we been talking about law? So part of what I think we need to be doing is we need to do with law and, to some extent, leadership, what I think Susan's work and the work of the other wonderful social psychologists who've spoken today have done with psychology, which is that we need to think about law in a larger context. So often when we think about law, the assumption is that we're only talking about litigation, that's the frame, and that lawyers are only about legal rules and risk avoidance, and the laws about legal rules and lawyers about litigation and essentially avoiding litigation risk. And of course, stereotypes have some correspondence to reality, right? So this is a very important and big and dominant part of what lawyers do. But it isn't all lawyers do, even though that's how many people think, including lawyers who are doing many other things about what it is that they do. So we need to reframe the way we think about law and lawyers so that we have created contexts in which the public resources can be used to create the kind of environments that we're talking about. So if we think about why this is necessary, in the context of litigation and in the frame of law, adjudication is the focal point. So everything is about either bringing or avoiding litigation. The law sets up the frame around first generation motivational behavioral model. And it imposes a fault frame, so the only time you can act in litigation, for the most part, is when you've done something that's viewed as blameworthy or wrong. You have to individualize responsibility. It polarizes and dichotomizes experts, and Susan has some very interesting work on this as well, and experiences of this as being an expert in litigation, which makes it very hard to get people to be experts in these cases because of what you go through when you become an expert, even though it's very important. And law has a tendency to leap from the individual to the policy level without thinking about the mediating processes and practices that need to be changed if you're actually going to have traction and have these things be sustained over time. And what's missing is culture and institutional dynamics, the levels where you can really get traction to make these kinds of change. So the litigation frame for law is problematic, partly because it's descriptively inaccurate of law's scope. Law does lots of other things besides litigation. Any of you who have experience with transactional lawyers know this. If you think about law in the it's really about designing institutions so that they will reflect a set of values. It doesn't always or even necessarily usually function that way, but it often does, and it often does in the areas where capital is most important. And the question is, how can we get law to function that way in the areas where we're talking about these very important values? We've already talked about the fact that law has this overly narrow conception, but that's not the only conception of bias and full participation that is relevant to the domains that involve government and public resources. And you can use NSF Advance as an example of that, but it's only one of many public contexts in which a broader frame, besides the narrow fault-based individualistic frame in the equal protection doctrine, is the framework for public values. Law is also constrained by an adversarial mindset. And we had the research we saw already in the earlier panel talked about the impact that has, cooperation versus competition, on the operation of stereotypes themselves, let alone the capacity to generate complex solutions for hard problems. Law introduces, if it's treated in this formalistic way, an overly narrow conception of risk. Risk is viewed only in terms of legal risk, and often in terms of whether you're going to be sued by the group that you wouldn't expect to be sued by. not whether you would be sued on the other side. But if you think about risk in a broader way, the risk of not being able to realize your values, the risk of bad publicity, the risk of not being the institution that you want to be, those are much broader notions of risk. And if you think only in a litigation frame, you're going to overly narrow the understanding of risk, which leads to an experience that many of you might have had, which is legal counsel coming to you and saying, oh, you have this great intervention, but I notice you're mentioning the word race. You can't do that. You can't even say the word. Well, that is an inaccurate view of what the law currently holds, and it's also an inaccurate risk assessment if you're looking at risk in this broader way. And finally, the litigation frame produces an ineffectual remedies and simplistic policy solutions, in part because if you've defined the problem in the wrong way, how are you going to develop a solution that is going to actually get to the problem? So that's not to say that there isn't a very, very important role for litigation. But it is not a sufficient role, and it should not be at the center of how we understand the role of law and lawyers. So I think that we need to do for law what we've been talking about doing for psychology, which is put it in a broader context, place courts in a larger arena. Think about the multiple arenas in which we need to be mobilizing public values and public resources to create public accountability for the kind of values that we've been talking about. How would we take an anti-discrimination agenda and put it in a broader normative frame? I've been playing with this language of institutional citizenship. That's only one term. There are lots of ways to talk about this, but we need to be thinking in much broader ways that are going to resonate with the environments in which these kinds of concepts have to be operationalized. And what if we thought about lawyers not as risk avoiders, but as facilitators of lawful innovation? As people who were positioned as they were at the Constitutional Convention to create a small c constitution for the environments that we want to help to create. I would venture to guess that the people we have sitting at the table here are doing just that. I'm looking forward to hearing from them, but I just want to give you one real-life example to say that this is not pie in the sky. So Jonathan Alger is the general counsel.
We should probably move over to our panel.
Sure. So Jonathan Alger does this. Our panel will demonstrate that this is possible. It is a role that lawyers can play, and that's all about building an architecture of inclusion that can work on these 5 levels.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. The challenge of working with with such a distinguished group of folks as a whole. Thanks a lot. So I want to follow the order of the program, which is going to move us across from right to left. And so our first speaker is Laura Liswood, who, among other things, just handed me a copy of her book. I have to say, in reading bios, this is as impressive a bio in terms of different kinds of things as I've seen. Actually, Laura, why don't you stay? You want me to stay here? Yeah. Why don't we stay here for this? But her latest book, The Loudest Duck: Moving Beyond Diversity While Embracing Differences to Achieve Success at Work, looks like really a fantastic piece, and I'm sure you'll talk about some of that as well.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thank you all for allowing me to be presenting here today. First and foremost, you may be either relieved or disappointed that I have no slides, nor any correlations. I was voted at the other business school up in Cambridge that I went to get my MBA. I was voted most likely to fall asleep in my statistics class. Setting
I don't think we have
framework
any
out there.
statistics faculty here.
Yeah.
I'm looking.
Or finance, for that matter. Which is why I appreciated so much, Michael, your gracious stereotyping of Goldman Sachs, which is where I work now. Part of my goal at Goldman Sachs, I was a managing director that started the Office of Global Leadership and Diversity, and now I'm a senior advisor to the firm, is to help take some of this analysis that we hear here and other places and make it real to people within an organization, within a corporation, because actions do have consequences. And so For me, I've used much of this research, Virginia Valian, Deborah Tannen, Anna Fell, Susan Fist, Michael Fox, Howard Gardner, et cetera, to build up what I talk about at Goldman. Catalyst research, Ernst & Young research, the World Economic Forum research, et cetera, around all of these things. Because, Susan, I am also a lawyer, and I believe that all of the things that most organizations are doing around diversity, inclusion, stereotyping, et cetera, that is things like senior management commitment and messaging and trainings and committees and networks and mentoring and all of those kinds of things that you'll find that advanced organizations really using as tools for their corporate development. I think they're all necessary, but as lawyers say, something is necessary but not necessarily sufficient. And I think it's not sufficient because the fact of the matter is we all do bring our unconscious selves to the workplace. Now, I don't, when I'm presenting to people at Goldman Sachs, I don't actually use the term stereotypes and bias because that's a pretty hard thing for people to take in if you use those words. So I have a tendency to use words like archetypes, preferences, perceptions, schemas that people unconsciously bring into the workplace. And we go through where people get these things from. And again, this is done in a way that people can sort of see for themselves. We get these beliefs from our religion, of course. We get these beliefs from our parents, which I tell all the people at Goldman Sachs make enough money to go to therapy. Get it all out. We get this stuff from our peers. I quote the American Council on Education that asked 11-year-old girls what would happen if tomorrow, if you came back as a boy. And the girls go, yeah, okay, fine, I'll climb a tree or whatever. And then they ask 11-year-old boys, what would happen if you came back tomorrow as a girl? And they're basically suicidal. They basically say things like, I would throw myself off a bridge. And so I say, you know, I don't have the nature-nurture answer, but I do know that something happened between 0 and 11 for the girls to go, yeah, okay, and the boys to go, I'd throw myself off a bridge. So something happened, and that's often the experience that you have with your peers, with your parents, with your teachers, et cetera. And certainly experiences, I actually went around the world and met almost all of the living women presidents and prime ministers and did a documentary on it in a book. And one of the experiences I had was talking to the president of Iceland, and she had been president for 16 years. And after she'd been president for about 8 years, she was going around Iceland, she's talking to the children. She noticed that for the children under 8, they all thought only a woman could be president of Iceland, and that the boys had to ask if they could be president of Iceland. So it's what I call the power of the mirror. That is what it is that you can be by what it is you see. And that's why I so appreciated, Valerie, some of your work around this reinforcing of who we are. Obviously, we get a lot of this from the media. The media is a huge conveyor of archetypes of who we are. I particularly am fond of looking at the myths, fables, and fairy tales of cultures because they're pretty well an indicator of a lot of values and of a lot of what people consider who people are. And basically 2 kinds of myths, the hero's journey, which is the young man who overcomes great odds and slays the dragon and defeats the evil empire and finds the Holy Grail and goes back to his kingdom or his tribe and gets his rewards, keys to the kingdom, pot of gold in the hand of the fair maiden. And that translates into Superman, Spider-Man, Star Wars, Star Trek, Indiana Jones, Mission Impossible, anything Bruce Willis is in. You know, so that archetype runs pretty heavily through. And the other archetype, of course, is the rescue me myth, which is basically the Cinderella myth, which the hero's journey is a good myth for leadership. The rescue me myth is not a good myth for leadership. You all remember Cinderella, you know, she's cleaning the fireplace and talking to the mice. And then she gets to go to the ball, you know, meets Prince, loses a shoe, and Prince rescues Cinderella. So you remember Sleeping Beauty? She's been on a table for 100 years, unconscious, until the prince kisses her, and then metaphor, she awakens. But she's been rescued. Although I do have to say I don't know what Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs is, other than perhaps a woman just multitasking with 7 little men. But at the point, you get my point. We pick up all of these things very unconsciously, and I call all of this of what we bring in, the religion, the parents, the peers, the myths, the media, et cetera, I call that grandma. So that we are all very professional people in all of our work, and we all bring grandma to work with us. and we all bring this unconsciousness to work with us. And so all of these things, even though, Susan, we've gone from macro inequities, the first generation, to micro inequities, the second generation, all of these things are embedded unconsciously into the workplace. And I actually learned the challenge of unconsciousness in the workplace in a very different workplace. On 9/11, I was down at Goldman Sachs, and I decided I wanted to do something to become a first responder. And so in what can only be described in that category of diversity as an age-defying thing, I went for 10 months to the Washington, D.C. Police Academy. So I'm a fully sworn police officer in the District of Columbia, the oldest living female mountain bike officer, and now a sergeant. Anyway, in the academy, they taught us that your most dangerous weapon is not your service weapon. Your most Glock 17s, for all you people who are into weapons. Your most dangerous weapon are your words. Your words spoken unconsciously, your actions done unconsciously, your reactions done unconsciously are guaranteed to get you into trouble. But your actions done consciously, words done consciously, will help you and others stay out of trouble. And we're talking about being on the street as a police officer. But that translates into any professional life. The police actually are taught something very specific. And you're talking about context, they are taught something called verbal judo. It is a way you speak consciously to people. And but we walk unconsciously into the workplace. And so the real question is the implications of that unconsciousness. And we talk about categories of diversity, but we really go beyond just the sort of what I call the Noah's Ark theory of diversity, which is, God, if we could only just get 2 of each in the ark, we would have our diversity. That would be it. We could just do that. But the problem is that the giraffe looks at the zebra and says, boy, you're funny looking. You've got a short neck and stupid black and white stripes, and I have a long neck, elegant neck and beautiful brown and white blotches. I don't know about you. That's what happens in Noah's Ark, and it does happen unconsciously. And so even things like legally protected things like nationality, well, in the workplace, it really comes down unconsciously to what do the British really think of the French. And in a multinational corporation, that's pretty important because you have that. Or, as Kim Campbell, Prime Minister of Canada, said, do we just think Canadians are unarmed Americans with health insurance? So, we have all of this that we bring into the workplace with us. What's our nationality, gender, what are our hobbies? Hobbies are one of the things that can immediately, as a diversity point, unlevel the playing field. You like sport, you like soccer, and you like, swimming. And somebody who works for you likes soccer, so you spend all your time chit-chatting with the person who likes soccer. And then when your promotion comes up, who do you give it to? The person who likes soccer. So being conscious in the workplace of all of these kinds of diversities, of all the kinds of things that Susan talks about, is essential because corporations, at least corporations, are hierarchies. They are not kibbutz and they're not communes. They are hierarchies, which means that there's more resources, more money up, and less money down. And people have the power in hierarchies to divide resources up. And do they do it fairly or do they do it unfairly? Is the playing field level or is it not? And part of the challenge is how to get people to get out what Howard Gardner talked about as an essential trait, how to get people to travel. That is, travel outside of their own worldview, which is actually an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. It's particularly difficult for historically in power groups to know what historically out of power groups are going through. Historically overrepresented groups have a tendency not to know about what historically out of power groups are going through. T.D. Jakes, for my new book, The Lost Duck, I interviewed T.D. Jakes, Bishop Jakes, an extraordinary man. And he said, yeah, an African-American man with a GED knows more about a white man than a white man with a PhD knows about an African-American man. Yeah. What is it that we know about people? How is it that we find out about people? And Kendall Wright, a researcher on this, talks about the issue of possibility and frequency. It is possible that we could all go outside and have the cab go right by us and not pick us up. It is possible. But what is the frequency at which it happens to me versus the frequency it might happen to someone else from one of the other historically out of power groups? So to get people to understand that these are some of the dynamics that are going on, so we can talk about Noah's Ark, but the fact of the matter is we all bring our unconscious selves into the workplace. I call it the elephant and mouse theory. I'm into my animals here. The elephant and mouse theory, which is if you're the elephant in the room, what do you need to know about the mouse? Not much. If you're the mouse in the room, what do you need to know about the elephant? Pretty much everything. which turns out to be, the question is, how do you get historically empowered groups to actually be aware of some of the dynamics that we've been talking about here today? How do you get them to travel outside of their worldview? We did focus groups with 4 different groups: white American men, women, minorities, and non-Americans. And as I told the senior executives, I had great news for them. One of the groups thought the organization was a meritocracy. 3 of the groups did not. You can imagine which of the groups thought it was a meritocracy. Because what happens is as you rise up in an organization with subtle inequities that occur, things that subtly advantage some and subtly disadvantage others based on your diversity, you get to the top and you say, of course it's a meritocracy. No one says, I got to the top of this organization because I was subtly advantaged. No one says that. They always think it's a meritocracy. So how to get them to understand that it is not a meritocracy, that it is an unlevel playing field. Diversity, I read somewhere that we hire people for difference, and then we fire them because they're not the same. Yeah. And so, again, taking all of this kind of research and making it consequential within the institution and creating the institutional mindfulness of it. And it translates very specifically into the workplace. When you're talking about the differing ways people act in an organization, the differing things that Grandma taught them. The reason my book is called The Loudest Duck is that by and large, Grandma, remember who Grandma is, Grandma taught American men, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Speak up and you'll get what you want. Grandma taught the Japanese that the nail that sticks out gets hit on the head, which is just the opposite. Grandma taught the Chinese the loudest duck gets shot. And Grandma taught women, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. Now, none of that is wrong, except for when you get into a diverse environment and you're sitting in your meeting and you're the manager and you have a wheel, a duck, a nail, and a nice in your meeting. The only person in this greatly diverse organization, and you wanted all this diversity and we all want it, the only person talking is the wheel. And then the manager hears the wheel and says, oh, wheel, good ideas. Wheel, good ideas. Wheel, good ideas. Promotion, wheel. And the nail, duck, nice, because they came in with a different grandma, are subtly disadvantaged in this process. So it's up to the institution to level the playing field. For the institution to be aware that we all bring our grandmas into the workplace and then to reach out to the nail, duck, and nice to speak up. But I also will say it's up to the individual to get a little out of their comfort zone of what Grandma taught them and speak up a little bit more. So it's a combination of 2 things. So, Susan, I think the institution is extraordinarily important, but the individual is also. And just a couple more examples of that is that we have found real problems with when it comes to, if you will, the differing ways Grandma taught people and how it will subtly advantage or disadvantage. Comes with things like critical feedback. Linda Hill, Harvard Business School research. If 2 people start at the same place, one gets mentoring, one gets stretch assignments, and one gets critical feedback, and the other does not, in 5 years' time, there will be a difference of performance. And the historically underrepresented groups have a tendency to not get the mentoring, not get the critical feedback, and not get the stretch assignments. And then, boy, at the end of the day, we're surprised when the historically underrepresented groups don't succeed because they're not getting the same thing. But I need to stop, but I'll just give you this example of feedback, because here's the problem with feedback. Like is very comfortable giving critical feedback to like. You know, you're very comfortable because you know how they'll react, you know how they'll act, you're very comfortable with it. You know, if I'd get angry about that feedback, I'm not so worried if you get angry about that feedback. I'm okay with that, okay? And so I just give you your feedback. But like is quite uncomfortable giving critical feedback to not like. Yeah. Because they're worried about, will the woman cry? Will this guy get angry? Will he do something? Will they rush to the legal department to sue me because they think that I don't like not likes? Because I'm giving them critical feedback. And then the human nature of the unconsciousness of diversity is I stop giving them critical feedback. And then the individual who's not like you doesn't get the critical feedback. I could go on with several other kinds of examples, but for us, it's taking all of this kind of research and then saying, how do we make it practical and actionable? Because there are real life consequences, because some people advance quickly and some people's advance is slow or not at all in the process. And I guess because I travel too much, I call that headwinds and tailwinds. who gets the headwinds and who gets the tailwinds. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was really, really a wonderful conversation. This is truly the hardest job in the place. We have a wonderful panel and trying to generate opportunities and hopefully some time for questions. Our next panelist, Monica Mantilla, is the founder, CEO, and president of Altura Capital. Also, I must add, a alum of Columbia Business School. I always think, as I told her before the panel, that the highest honor is being invited back to speak, I think repeatedly, to your at your alma mater, which is sort of, in some sense, the highest compliment. So welcome, Monica.
Thank you very much. Well, it is definitely a pleasure to be here today and always. In order to provide a framework of what I'm going to share with you, I think it's important to tell you a little bit about the industry I'm in and the statistics around that industry, and then tell you a bit about our role as a firm and the work or I do with a group of organizations and individuals around diversity. So I'm in the asset management world, in the financial world, and as many of you know, it's an industry that is where the large majority of participants are old white men, right? And so very few women, very little diversity. It's truly a fascinating industry because it gives you the opportunity and the true honor to be the trusted advisor of multi-billion-dollar institutional investors, and to help guide them in the investment decisions is truly an absolutely fascinating job. If you look at the U.S. tax-exempt marketplace, how big that industry is, it's around $12.5 trillion. And our job as a firm at Altura Capital, we track around 1,420 new every month emerging money managers. So that's small, nimble, entrepreneurial firms that typically run less than 10 billion of assets under management, that are usually entrepreneurial organizations. Around 28% of them are women and minority-owned firms. And these firms happen to have, today, the market share that these firms have is around 1.6 billion, around 1.6%, around $240 billion of the whole pie. So it's a very small market share, and it's one that raises the question, is it that they don't perform as well? What are the challenges? How do we get how do we create the conditions so that hopefully 20 years away from now we will have a much more inclusive marketplace? The topic of today is truly fascinating to me because I must share with all of you that it is something that we never talk about in our industry. Even when Bruce called me and said, we're going to talk about stereotypes and biases, I said, what the hell is that? We never talk about it. It's not something that comes in our industry. And we have many emerging manager conferences. We have institutional investor conferences, pensions and endowments conferences. And the concept is never out there. We do talk about diversity, and even the concept of diversity sometimes generates a negative reaction because there's also the presidents of many who decided to follow the Noah's Ark strategy, and then it didn't have a positive outcome because when you make a decision inside an institutional investor of hiring a certain firm because you have a political pressure, you have a trustee pressure, and that firm doesn't end up performing, what it creates is a negative precedent that not only affects that firm, but affects the firms to come. So I was an investment management consultant, advising pension funds and endowments in this world. And in 2005, I came to the realization that it was important to shed light in these firms, in these emerging firms, that through our research, we saw how they consistently performed better than their larger peers and brought, many value adds and traits and innovation to the table, but that were just not able to participate effectively. And I had, the good fortune and, through a lot of persistence and work throughout the country and the world, managed to talk with many CIOs and trustees of these institutional investment firms. And I asked them the question, why is it that you don't engage with smaller, nimbler entrepreneurial firms? And there was always a list of objections that were very valid objections. If you have, let's say, a large pension fund like a CalPERS or a City of New York or a State of North Carolina, you're trying to mobilize $200 billion or $100 billion. You can't really say, here's a small private equity fund or a small hedge fund, and I'm going to give you 5 million or 10 or 20 million, because you need to mobilize significant pieces of capital. So we took that process of understanding what were the key objections, and it was an issue around size, an issue around absence of information, and we created a firm that would help institutional investors to in fact get that data, get that information, analytics around these firms, and compare them against their larger peers. But it is an industry where there's still a lot to do, and it's a recurring theme in my mind about how to create the conditions so that 20 years away from now, we look at our industry and we truly see a large participation of women-owned firms, of minority-owned firms. One of my conclusions has been that hearing a lot from what has come to the table today, it is important to create a national and consistent dialogue with all key constituents. And it is a complex battle. It includes federal legislators, state legislators, trustees, CIOs, CEOs, large firms who can play a key mentoring role. So it's a very complex issue, but it is an issue that I think that if the conditions are there and the interest of the stakeholders are there, that we truly can create an industry where there is the opportunity for the full participation of all sources of investment talent. Bruce asked me also to mention a little bit about the work we're doing with Treasury and with economic recovery related issues. One of the things we're doing now is helping as a manager to manage some of the managers that are called emerging managers that are helping Treasury through economic recovery and TARP related issues, specifically under CPP. I want to say that from the side of Treasury and from large institutional investors, this is a very difficult and challenging issue to tackle, because they have the underlying premise of we need to be compliant to fiduciary responsibility. We need to work with the best and the largest. And though there's always the challenge of then how do you create that inclusive model, but really have the comply with your fiduciary duty of working with the best. To address that, we've created an intellectual framework called Diversity in the Management of Investments. Our definition of diversity is the commitment of institutional investors to work with all sources of investment talent. Our feeling and our view is that you're truly not complying with a fiduciary responsibility if you're just systematically deciding to only work with part of the talent. So that if you want to be in compliance of your fiduciary responsibility, you have to create a system that allows you to truly understand and be exposed to all sources of investment talent, to all sources of investment solutions, and then create a process to bring the best in every one of the asset class that you're interested in working with. The Obama effect has been brought up here, and I truly think that it is a fascinating issue and a huge catalyzer of change across many industries, including ours. I'll tell you a personal story. I received right after the transition team was created a letter from President Obama inviting me to participate in these tables and gave me a telephone number to call. I didn't call because I thought I was going to call, and it was 1-800-OBAMA, and I didn't call. I didn't believe that could be something that could. And I actually then did receive a call and was invited to, several dozens of conversations where issues around, I was invited to, CEO leadership tables, diversity of asset management, women-owned issues, Latino issues. And I do believe that the White House and the administration is creating the conditions so that these the concept of full inclusion and opportunity for everyone who has the ability to provide resources and expertise can be there. But I think that the key and fundamental lesson that I have experienced as an individual is that you will always have barriers. There will always be someone saying, you know, you're not supposed to be a money manager, you're not supposed to be running billions of dollars, you're not supposed to, and those will always be there, you know, and so that the clarity of mind to know that you're the architecture of your own destiny, and to just be persistent and just, you know, disregard them and move forward with, and continue to be trained and continue to get yourself better. I think that, you know, that is the formula of every success story that I've ever heard. And biases and stereotypes will always be there, whether you're, whatever it may be. You know, if you're an old white man, you may go to a country where that's not the bias. So, you know, we are a diverse world where there will always be differences in the way we're raised, in you know, there's a famous philosopher, Spanish philosopher, Ortega y Gasset, that says, yo soy yo y mis circunstancias. No, we are how we were raised, how we were treated by our parents, how we were, you know, the social and economic environment, and we sort of rewire ourselves as we move forward in life. And I think that the biggest reaction and the biggest counter to stereotypes and biases is kill them with capabilities, you know, just move forward and never let that be a, you know, because some people will just, oh, it's because there's always a list of possible things that you could say because of this and this, and they're just, I think sometimes like sound beats that you just don't pay attention to and move forward. I have a sign to stop, so it's a pleasure to be here and happy to answer any questions.
You talked about the word inclusive, and I thought it was interesting that our last panelist, Joellen Helmer, has a title of the leader. Inclusiveness is in the title at Ernst & Young. So it'd be great if you could sort of, you know, kind of finish off in thinking about your perspectives on this from, I think, a position where you're really in charge of implementing these issues.
Thank you, and I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach based on what you just said in my discussion with Bruce, and I'm going to talk about how we really put this into practice. And I'm not going to give you a lot of statistics, even though we are a public accounting firm and I'm a CPA. I actually only wrote down a couple, but just to share why our firm is so focused on diversity and inclusion. You know, when we start out at the firm, at the staff level, from the standpoint of gender, it's 50% women and 50% men. And from a ethnic diversity standpoint, it's about 40% ethnically diverse folks, and then 60% that are non-minority or non-ethnically diverse. And then when we look ahead and we look at our partnership, the numbers dwindle. And they dwindle pretty fast. So at the partnership level, there's about 17% women. And so you could see it really goes down pretty quickly. And it starts about at the senior manager level. So we're looking okay, even at the manager level, and then it just dips very quickly. Similar story on the ethnic minority side as well. And the numbers are worse, so I'm not even going to quote them. So really what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time, because our firm has recognized for some time now, and over the past few years we've put the I in our approach, because you hear often people talking about diversity, gender equity and things of that nature, and we felt that they needed to go hand in hand, because we did have the issues around the white male feeling left out. And so not that we're giving up diversity, we're not by any means, but focusing on inclusion is equally important, and we believe that to be competitive globally, you need to focus on both the D and the I. And so probably about a year ago, Dr. Mahzarine Banaji came and she spoke at one of our women's leadership conferences, and it was all about this topic. So I've been really amazed listening to all of you today, and actually some of the examples that I saw from some of the people that were up here on the panel were very similar in the discussion. And based on this presentation, our leaders at the firm were very intrigued by the whole concept of, you know, Dr. Banaji, she calls it implicit association. She really doesn't like the word bias, but it seems that people at our firm can't get away of using unconscious bias in some of those terms. And so after this conference, when we listened to Dr. Banaji speak and all the research that was done, our leaders said, well, we really need to look into this more and talk about how this can impact our organization. Because as you've heard from everybody here, whether people like it or not, it affects how they behave. It's going to affect how people are promoted. You could see it based on the numbers, and it's not all bias, obviously. Some people, there's a choice where people leave and so forth, but it's based, we saw it in how we were promoting people. We saw it in salary, just comparing two people at the same level. We saw it in how we were assigning jobs. They were pushing women to go on the not-for-profit engagements, while some of the men were getting all the big Fortune 500 client company experiences. So, it's something that we recognized. And so what we did after Dr. Banaji actually not only spoke at our leadership conference, she has presented at all of our regions in the U.S. and in Canada. And what all of our people were asking is, well, okay, this is great. We understand we have these unconscious biases. Now what do we do with this information? And so we've created a program, and it's called Leadership Matters, and I love the name of it. And it's all about bias and how we treat individuals. And what was really different about this program was it was focused on the individual, meaning how we interpersonally look at ourselves and what our own biases are, and how we actually identify and say, I do have biases and these are my biases. And then taking that information and putting it into practice. So I think it was Dana that spoke about you react differently when you know what your unconscious biases are. So we've rolled this program out to all of our partners, and our next wave of this is to roll it out below the partner level. So we have webcasts and things of that nature just to get this message out. There are all sorts of tools that we use that Dr. Banaji and others have introduced. We're working with another company that has developed this training for our people. And at the highest level, it's really getting people comfortable with the fact that they have these unconscious biases. And there's different tests that you can take that are all free, they're all online, and it's a requirement before you actually attend the course. So that before you get to the course, you know what your unconscious biases are. And throughout the course, they talk about and they teach us, and it'd probably be better if I was up here a year from now, because I could tell you the impact that it had on our firm. But throughout the course, they are telling us what to do differently. So when you walk in a room, just being aware of the dynamics in the room. So if you walk in and you have a diverse team, which we all say, that you have a diverse team, you're going to get a better answer. Looking at the dynamics, and we call it this whole insider-outsider mentality. And so I can give you an example on one of my engagements, and it's something that I've done differently that maybe I didn't do 2 years ago. So I walk into one of my team rooms on an audit, and I see there's a young black woman sitting in the corner, and she's working away, working very hard, been doing a great job. And then I see another group of people that are sitting close together, they're laughing, they're talking, and she's not saying anything. Now, a couple years ago, I probably would have recognized that. I probably would have said something to the senior manager, in private about why is she being left out. But what I did is I actually walked up to this young black woman and I asked her if everything was okay. And I asked her why she wasn't sitting with the other people. And I'm looking at your reaction here, she actually asked me to go out in the hallway and talk to her about it. And she said she was uncomfortable because they had so much in common. They, went out after work and they had become friends. But she appreciated me talking to her. Well, she came back in the room. Well, her and I continued to have a conversation. And the dynamics of the room changed completely. All of a sudden, I'm talking to her, and then everybody else joins in the conversation because I'm the partner in the room at the highest level, and they were intrigued. Well, wow, you're having this conversation with her. Well, the next day when I went out there, I'll tell you the dynamics were very different. Everybody was talking to everybody. Now, I can't say they've all are best friends now, But it just occurred to me that our actions, and maybe in this case there was some unconscious bias going on in the room, just have a huge impact on how a team acts. And so our firm's feeling is that if we can crack this code, that, you know, big picture, obviously competitive advantage, but from the standpoint of working more effectively as a team, that's going to have a much bigger impact on how we're, you know, the quality of work we're doing for our clients, how our employees feel about working at the firm, how long they stay, and hopefully in the end, the promotion process. And one last thing to point out with this, so that's a team example. We also have these champions, they're called inclusive and flexibility champions, and they sit in on all of our roundtable discussions that we have. And our roundtable discussions are basically, you get a room full of people and you assign performance ratings, which then drives their compensation increases. And it's almost like the inclusive and champion is sort of the police of this unconscious bias. They will call it out. If they hear two people that are being presented that sound exactly the same experiences, et cetera, somebody's going to call that out in the meeting to try to remove this unconscious bias that's going on so that there's not any impact on this person's performance rating. So those are a couple of examples. The hope is that when we all get through this training that we will be a better firm overall, and that people will recognize that they have these unconscious biases and that they will react differently both as an individual, in a team atmosphere, and then from a performance rating standpoint, so everybody's given the opportunity for leadership positions. Thank you.
So I think we have some microphones here, and while people are, we have these two on the side. I don't know if there's, we can sort of pass those around. I wanted to at least give one kind of anecdote of how I became aware of some of these issues. When I was a much younger professor, I was sitting on a search committee, and this was back about a decade ago. And some of your comments, Susan, about, you know, CVs and some of the other things, how we think about this. And, you know, what search committees normally do in academia, we divided up all the, 300 things that we got into, five piles, and each one of us got a pile of the CVs to look at, and we all, came back with the people who we thought would be good out of the pile. And, we talked about a few, and we ended up with a group of 19 people we wanted to interview. And it was the administrator in the group who pointed out that of those 19 people, every one of them was male. All 19. And, we sort of looked at this and said, geez, this is sort of not a very good outcome. So what we did is we divided up and just looked at the CVs of the women in the group and went through and said, we're going to find 5 people that we're going to interview at the meeting. So we bumped our numbers up from 19 to 24 interviews. And as it turned out, the one person we made a job offer to that year was actually one of the 5 women out of that pile. And the interesting question was what happened in the context, in a group of people, each looking at a set of CVs, et cetera, something, unconscious or conscious or otherwise, led to an outcome that would have otherwise not been a very good outcome. And I think one of the things as we think about institutionally within the business school of kind of thinking about search and sort of how does one sort of institutionalize some of the issues, and this does come in at different levels, was just sort of really trying to, institute some things that say, one, it's important to have, to look at a diverse group of people. And, that in and of itself seems to have had an effect within the organization. And so we've ended up, the percentage of women on our faculty has doubled in the last 5 years. And that's not a target. It's not that we have some number we're looking at. But it is something that I think in the school, we think of diversity as something that's really important. And it's a challenge of how to sort of implement that. And I thought about some of your slides as well in kind of the process of how does one go through an organization, 5 steps, et cetera, to think about that. So it is, I think it's something that all of us have to work on at lots of levels, but it's something that is an incredibly important process and one, that certainly in business schools, which are not thought of as necessarily the most diverse organizations in the world, how we can, as a group, try and take on those issues. So it's something I think we think is important in the process. But I think had a lot of different perspectives on how to think about this, and I sit on the board of a small hedge fund. So I appreciate the challenges of small money managers as well in the process. So I wanted to open up now to questions for people in the room. Obviously, a wonderful group of incredibly distinguished panelists. So, yes.
Thanks. I really appreciated Joellen's description of what you did in Ernst & Young. I'm wondering if from the other members, if there were 1 to 3 things, if you came into an organization to identify to help with the recognition of stereotypes as being a fact, diversity being issues, inclusion being issues, where would you start? What would be your 1 to 3 things that you would tell an organization to start doing?
No, I do have an answer for that, and I brought notes of some of the framework of workshops we do with boards, and we say that DMI begins with a decision at the top level to introduce diversity in the management of investments in a disciplined, structured, process-oriented way. In our point of view, with the work we do, everything starts at the top. It permeates throughout the organization, and there has to be a lot of alignments of incentives and performance incentives, measurement around accomplishing the goal. But I believe that it's a board, it's the trustees, it's the people at the helm of the organization who, if they want to introduce a philosophy and a discipline as this one, otherwise doing a bottom-up approach is almost next to impossible, right? So that would be my first thought.
I would just echo that, because if I look at some of the change that's gone on in our firm over the years, the tone at the top is absolutely essential. I firmly believe that our firm believes that it's not just the right thing to do, that it's really a competitive advantage. And if you're not doing it, you're not going to be competitive globally. So that to me is the starting point. The thing that I think we were missing over the years was the inclusiveness aspect. And so we were very silo-focused on gender and ethnicity. And so, over the past few years, and we've been focused on inclusiveness as a whole, I think that's important as well. And I think if our firm had to do it all over again, you don't want to lose the silos or the affinity groups, because it's very important, but you need that broad umbrella of inclusiveness to really make it work. So that would be another point that I'd like to make.
I think I'd probably get down a little bit to the bricks and mortar of it all. First and foremost, I'd ensure that the organization had disaggregated data for groups, because to just say all employees think this organization is X isn't going to get you what you need, because all employees are not experiencing the organization as X. So you really have to disaggregate the data, and we've done that at Goldman, so we can see what's happening with different groups and how they perceive the organization and how they get to it. I would probably have nice conversations with senior leadership, and I haven't met a senior leader who isn't committed to diversity. I just haven't met one, but that's not the point, because that's necessary but not sufficient. I would probably say, okay, let's figure out what the unwritten rules are in this organization and who knows them and who doesn't. Because unwritten rules are some of the things, the biggest gatekeepers for people. Who gets those unwritten rules and who doesn't, and how those are translated and transferred to others. If you look like me, and boy, you remind me of myself when I was young, and I'm going to tell you all the things about how to succeed in this organization, and you don't look like me, and I'm not so sure I can talk to you anyway, and oh my gosh, what if I went out to dinner with you anyway? People would think I was having an affair or something like that, whatever. And so I don't give you those unwritten rules. So I'd probably do that. Then I'd get back down to the unconsciousness of very specific things. How do people ask for promotions? How do people state their accomplishments? What kind of feedback do they get? How do they negotiate? What are the speech patterns? How do people demand things? What are the reactions to people of differing groups if they do these things? Are there social consequences to these kinds of things? Is there a social consequence for a woman negotiating for a raise versus a man negotiating for a raise? Is there a social consequence for a woman stating her accomplishments versus a man, or a Japanese man stating his accomplishments? You know, who does that, and who gets socially punished for it, and who gets socially praised and rewarded for it? So you really have to get down to that level of unconsciousness, because it is exactly what Susan says. It's those small things over time that add up to why certain people get there and certain people don't get there. And you know, the thing about diversity is you know, we talk about the business case, and we know all the return on investment numbers and all of that kind of stuff and all of that. But the truth is that our belief really is what James Sarawicki talks about in The Wisdom of Crowds. He says if you've got a homogeneous group of people and you add another member of the homogeneous group to the homogeneous group, they bond quickly, but the incremental creativity is slight. If you have a member of the heterogeneous group added to the homogeneous group, they do not bond quickly, but the incremental creativity is much greater. He says what you're really looking for is cognitive diversity, the differing ways people go about approaching things. But the real question is your organization getting all of the cognitive diversity from everyone? That would be my sort of schema for how to look at this.
So I just want to put the three comments in an architecture, because I think each one of those is really helpful, but if they're not built into some kind of more systematic, multi-level project, they end up essentially being one shot. And I think what we've heard in all these three presentations is that they have been systematized. So just to name them quickly, so that you're identifying and creating roles for leaders that are systematic. It isn't only the person at the top, it's some way to develop leadership over time and systematize that. Number two, you're building the capacity for reflection, so it's not just disaggregated data, but you're asking a series of questions in an ongoing way at multiple levels, generating new categories of data that can track institutional change. And number three, inclusion, connecting the framework to larger issues of mission and really thinking about that in a way that's going to connect to core values. And I think that's even beyond inclusion. We heard that. It's not just inclusion connected to advancing productivity. If you're not making those connections, it's not going to stick. And at the same time, it has to be done in a way that keeps the issue of race and bias and participation at the table.
I would just like to reinforce from a psychological point of view what you folks have all been saying, because I think one of the biggest take-home messages is going to be there's no one solution, and there's no one problem either. I've come across some analyses indicating that this issue of at every decision point in a person's career, even 2% bias can create the outcome that all the CEOs are male, you know, and so it's kind of death by 1,000 cuts, and I think we have to keep that in mind, that at every single stage there's a teeny weeny bit of bias, you know, that might not be remarkable by itself, but it just multiplies like compound interest. So I think it's important to be attentive to the, you know, the details at every stage, but I also think that there are patterns to think about, you know, at all these stages of decision making. And I would argue that one of the interventions is really a time-tested one in social psychology and sociology, which is what works to get intergroup interactions, to get intergroup contact to be successful. And a big element of that is interdependence. People have to have shared goals. They have to need each other for something. And it can't be pretend. It can't be food festivals and flags, you know. It has to be real goals that people really care about. And we know this from decades of research on school desegregation. Gordon Allport was the first person to mention this. And it's not accidental that in our model, interdependence, that is cooperation or competition, is the key dimension that predicts warmth. And one of the things that Dan Ames and I are hoping to do, this is my Dan Ames, not the other one, is to look at the differences in really fundamental social cognition and neural responses when somebody needs somebody else to be on their side, to work with them. And I think it's going to be, I'm hoping, that it really will show that there's a fundamental difference in the way you cope with somebody who is like, on your team. The other feature, though, I think, is the status hierarchy and this assumption of meritocracy and problematizing it and understanding that people make these assumptions, as Laura Listwood said, when you get to the top, you say, oh, yes, of course, I deserve this, And the more that people can understand that it's a temporary role, it's a hat that people put on, and they get given different hats at different stages, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're intrinsically better people than the people who aren't wearing that hat, And so I think I'm not quite sure how you work with this, but certainly having the people at the top of the company say, this is important, this matters, we aren't going to be competitive unless we are inclusive. That also follows from Gordon Allport's principles of how desegregation and intergroup contact are successful. Authority sanctions are really important. So just reinforcing what you guys are saying.
Just if I can add to that, Susan, because I think you're so right, but I'm always challenged by how to get people to change. What is it that motivates people to change? And just because we're in this academic environment, Thucydides said, people change for only 3 reasons: fear, self-interest, or honor. Yeah, which I think could be translated into modern terms of pain, gain, or vision. And so it seems to me, just Susan, as you're talking about the holistic construct, you have to have all 3 to get people, is it too painful if I don't change? What will I gain if I do change? And does my senior leadership, do I have a vision? Does my leadership have a vision of where we're going to go? Because any one of those things without the other is not going to get you there.
Well, thank you very much to everybody here, especially again Bruce and Michael and Malia on the organizational side, Susan, for your wonderful remarks over the course of the day, and to what I thought was just an absolutely outstanding panel here what is now this afternoon. Michael, do you have any?
All I wanted to say is, following up on the pain and gain comments, our formal presentations are over, but the conference is not over. We have lunch for everybody, and hopefully an hour of informal conversations about topics of shared interest. So look forward to meeting as many of you as we can.